Hola, good morning sa lahat. Magandang umaga sa iyo. So, first, pardon me kung yung presentation ko is may watermarks ng Filmora kasi gumagamit lang ako ng premium. Which is, ang available na free lang niya na recording is 5 minutes. So, first, let's have our title. So, our topic for these discussions this morning is the Modern English Part 1. But first, of course, let's have our adjectives. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to understand the modern English to the present development of language with different century and each spelling and sounds. So again, our title for this discussion this morning is the Modern English Part 1. After 1700s, there are fewer major language internal changes than in the previous period. However, there are many external developments as a result of colonialism. So, ito yung colonialism na tinatawag nila na American, tungkol sa America, sa Asian English, like sa Singapore, South Asian English, sa American English, sa Australian English, sa Kenyan English, and South African Indian English, and New York Puerto Rican English. And also, the closer we get to the modern English, the better we can investigate the details of language use, such as the differences due to the gender, age, region, and socio-economic status of the speaker. And of course, there are many sociolinguistic studies devoted to this aspect. Okay, first, let's have the external history and sources in social and political terms. So, this is the second part of the 17th century that marks the beginning of a very volatile period in the history of Britain. So, the Civil War starts in 1642. Okay, take note, 1642. And the Republican Commonwealth, led by Cromwell, is proclaimed during 1649, and the monarchy is restored in 1660, which is called the Restoration. Okay, Restoration yung tawag sa 1660. And while the Renaissance was characterized by freedom, this period is characterized by a search for stability, correctness, and standardization. So the period between 1650 and 1800, it was also led to what is later called the Age of Reason and to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is an 18th century movement characterized by reliance on science, reason, and concern for humanity. It may be considered responsible for certain social and political changes towards the end of the 18th century. So the American independence, it was happened during 1776, and the French Revolution, it was 1789, and the abolition of slave trade by British Parliament, it was 1807. And the Romanticism, it was 19th century movement with an emphasis on nations and peoples may also have stimulated those changes. And also, Romanticism is a philosophical and literary movement at the end of 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century that emphasizes a subjective approach to topics such as nature, mysticism, dreams, and emotion. In many respects, it is a reaction to the rational ideas of the Enlightenment, even though it also builds on them. So text is a multitude becomes available after 1700. So modern English is much more varied than Old English. There are many varieties of spoken English during this time. Newspaper articles, advertisement, emails, formal writings, and etc. So the early part of this period, especially the Enlightenment, okay, take note, the Enlightenment period, they produced a number of encyclopedia, philosophical, and scientific works, grammar and dictionary, and so on. So during in the 17th century, 34 grammars were produced in Britain. In the 18th century, that number became 235 by Michael on 1970. So here are some important words of this time. So first, the English translation of Père Bales during the time of 1710, which is he named it the Critical and Historical Dictionary, and the 1721 Dictionary by Nathan Bailey, and the 1727 work by Chambers Encyclopedia or Universal Dictionary. The 19th century is characterized by the Industrial Revolution, which transformed a mainly agricultural society into an industrial one, and can be said to start in limited ways after 1700. So it is characterized by an increased use of machines and factories as well as urbanization. So both industrialism and imperialism led to many linguistic changes during this time. And by the way, I forgot to mention to you earlier about the English imperialism. So during the period of Victoria, reign of Victoria from 1819 to 1901, so dito yung hard time talaga maglabas ng mga sulat nila ng mga American writers. Because both industrialism and imperialism led to many linguistic changes. So there are some British and American writers from the late 18th century and the 19th centuries are given during this time. So the 19th century is actually characterized by revolutions in art. For example, Cubism, Surrealism, which is abstract expressionism, minimalism, performance art. So there are many changes in political and social ideas during this time, and it includes the anti-communism of the 1950s. Again, the anti-communism of the 1950s and the civil liberties movement of the 1960s, and the anti-Vietnam movement of the 1970s in the United States. So these changes actually lead to the introductions of many new words, mga bagong mga words. Actually, there are writers of this period that are too numerous to mention. Sobrang dami nila para i-mention pa natin dito lahat. So I put the list dito sa PowerPoint ko na lang, tapos hindi na natin siya isusulat lahat. In the 20th century, it becomes harder to classify writers as American, British, or Kenyan. Kasi yung iba mas pinili nilang mag-relocate. Kasi sobrang dami na eh. Mahirap nang i-classify kung anong klaseng English siya. Kasi nagkahalo-halo nga dun dahil sa colonialism. So second, we have modern English spelling and sound. So the spelling is relatively stable and changes. So mas madali siyang intindihin dito, mas recognizable siya, mas madali siyang intindihin kasi nga as we discussed in the previous chapter, around 1,700 English becomes more recognizable per speaker of modern English. But there are still variant spelling even in formal writings. For example, honor na may siya, yung spelling niya is, di ba, yung dalawa yung klase ng spelling ng honor. Meron siyang N-O-U, meron ding N-O-R lang siya. And so on. Webster's spelling books and dictionary published in 1800s. So, dito, binago ni Webster, he changed his mind apparently under the influence of Benjamin Franklin. So, ito yung sa 1850s naman, spelling is standardized on both sides of Atlantic. But there are numerous attempts at spelling reform by the editors of Chicago Tribune. So, ang mga nag-attempt nito na baguhin yung spelling reform ay sina George, Mark, at saka yung and others. So, that time, ito yung mga letra na i-standardize sana nila. Pero, nagkaroon ng difficulty. Difficulty to get a letter such as the one that sabi nila na is standardized spelling na new spelling. So, it was suggested by British and American Spelling Society. Suggest daw yun ng British and American. And was almost accepted as the standard by the British Parliament in 1949. O diba? Ito daw yung standard na spelling. So, tawag dito siya, nitong sinulat na we instinctively shrink from any and etc. This was called new spelling. So, ito nga yung sinabi ko kanina, during the time, in the 1949, at the moment, there do not seem to be many serious attempts at spelling reform. In fact, spelling may be getting more codified due to spell checkers on our computers. So, they more focus on the correct pronunciation also becomes a major concern in the modern English period. So, ito yung sinabi din ni George Bernard Shaw for it in the preface to Pygmalion in 1916. He said, "It is impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman despise him." So, to this day, regional differences in pronunciation are used to determine where a speaker of English comes from, and this stigmatized if uttered outside the right context. So, ito yung sinabi ni George. During this time, ito yung major concern in modern English, yung correct pronunciation talaga. So next is we have modern English morphology. So morphology is the changes in words which change their functions. Phenomenal forms, verbal endings, adverbs, and adjectives. So, the trend towards a more analytic language and the expected loss of case and agreement continues in modern English. So, in this section, we will just examine the pronominal forms, verbal, yung sinabi mo niya, endings, adverbs, and adjectives. For example, the morphology of English. As with sounds, it is difficult to describe the morphological changes in neutral terms since many are stigmatized. And lastly, but not the least, we have modern English syntax. So, in this section, there are many discussions and some developments about the increase in the use of auxiliaries and words such as like discontinuity of English towards becoming a more analytical English. And it also involves with relative pronoun and pronunciation of syntax. For example, may I go now, can I go now, and there are many meanings: permission, ability or possibility, and violation. Two of these meaning ability and permission. So, ito yung sinasabi yung kanina na there are also developments related to the relative pronouns, but we are stopped by prescriptive rules. So, in addition, we will consider how a corpus can be used to study the differences between formal and less formal English, and examine the changes in punctuation where they are relevant to syntax. So, in modern English, restrictive relatives are formed by using that or a W and H pronoun because relative pronouns show much variation throughout the history of English. The changes they undergo are stopped in two ways: by language external. Prescriptive for syntax is the tool used in writing proper grammatical sentence. And again, I am Vincent Isado, your reporter for today's discussion of Modern English Part 1. So if you have some question about this topic, you should just, you can reach me out on my Facebook, Vincent Isado, and the PPT, the copy of this presentation, I will paste it on my description box of my YouTube. You can just download the presentation, the copy presentation of this one. And thank you for watching and listening with me for today's discussion.